Well, today on Pastors on Porn, I wanted to talk about what has become a huge news item, the murder of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of them Asian women by a self-confessed sex addict. I've done quite a bit of reading and looking into it and trying to figure out what's the case of what's going on, what's just, crazy news reports. And from what has been pretty widely reported, apparently this young man had been asked to leave his home because of his obsessive porn watching. I mean, he's in his early 20s. Also, the apparent growth in his sexual addiction had led him to frequent massage parlors for sexual purposes, similar to the ones that he now walked into and shot these people in. And the big item of conversation, of course, is whether or not this is a hate crime. And obviously it didn't help an extremely ill-advised explanation by a police officer with his own bad track record was not the appropriate spokesperson to try to explain it, and he has been removed. But you know what? There's been a lot of talk about whether or not this is a hate crime. Now, if you have been listening to my sister podcast called Finding Traction, you will have listened to the most recent conversation I had with a therapist, Andrew Bowman. And he talks about, among other things, this whole topic of misogyny. From his book, he's got 2 books, of course, The Sexually Healthy Man, and his book, The Psychology of Porn. Once again, misogyny is the hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women. And Andrew explores the whole question, around pornography and is pornography and misogyny linked. And in that interview, I push back for many men who don't immediately feel like they hate or are averse to women. And in that interview, I'd really encourage you to listen to it if you haven't. Andrew says the following. He says, "I love women and I hate women." And he goes on and describes that as a PSR, or a pornographic style of relating. And what he said is many men develop a love-hate relationship with women as a result of the warping of their minds through pornography consumption. This is the way Andrew says it. He says their unconscious thoughts are this: women are a part of my shame. I hate my shame. Therefore, I hate women. Put another way, there's a combination of venom towards yourself, self-contempt, and contempt or venom projected outwards, other-centered contempt. And it's pretty easy to look at that event in Atlanta and go, was there hate involved? Well, obviously there was hate involved at a number of levels. Hate towards this man himself, hate directed at the women who he associated with this hatred. Now, let me just stop there for a second. I want to be really clear. I am in no way implying that it was these women's fault. And I don't know all what was going on in the mind of this young man other than what apparently he communicated. But I think all of us can understand self-hate, self-loathing. Whether or not the outgrowth of our actions would ever lead us to contemplate such a thing. Addiction causes people to do crazy things. It causes them to do hurtful things. It can cause them to do hateful, murderous things. Here's an example. How many people commit suicide, the ultimate act of self-hatred, because they don't see any hope of change? We call it suicide, but it's just violence expressed inward. Apparently, this young man had confessed to a friend about thoughts of suicide, ending it all. Now, he chose to express that in a different way. For example, the abuse of alcohol or drugs is second to depression as the most frequent risk, the risk factor for suicidal behavior. There is a close link between acts of suicide and the feelings of desperation when there's no hope of changing our out-of-control actions. So I've been wrestling with this event, and I've had a number of thoughts. You don't have to agree with me on all of these. These are just my thoughts as I've thought this event through from a number of different angles and working with men who would express addictive behaviors in different ways and at different levels. So here's just some random thoughts I've had. I want to just walk through them. First one, it's interesting that there is a reluctance to accept the idea of sexual addiction as real and valid in our culture. I've been interested listening to some of the news accounts, and they've been totally minimizing this whole idea of sexual addiction. Here's one quote from an article that was sent to me. Contrary to cultural belief, psychiatrists don't consider sex addiction as an actual addiction, disorder, or diagnosis. Now, that's interesting. And if you know anything about psychiatrists, anything about the medical field, there's a huge controversy around the DSM. That's the Bible of what is considered to be in and out of medically diagnosed disorders. And for example, there has been a reluctance to put sexual addiction in the DSM because there's so many who are afraid of it becoming associated with sex negative. Now, we spoke about sex positive and sex negative movements a while, and there's this whole idea, well, how do we figure out what is ordered and disordered sexual practices, and how do we keep shame out of it? And then there's the whole argument of whether or not the same-sex attraction, we've just got that out of, and homosexuality out of the DSM. The last thing we want to do is go backwards and put sex back into the DSM. I mean, there's this whole thing. It doesn't mean that those who work in the field of therapy don't recognize, because they see it staring themselves in the face, the effects, of sexual addiction. So that's interesting in terms of how people have responded to the idea of this man saying he was a sex addict. I challenge anyone who's read the research around the effects of porn to somehow portray it as something that's positive to the flourishing of women, the flourishing of people, or the flourishing of society. That's why I would say the second thing that I've just, become so clear around is this whole idea that pornography in general remains a destructive pursuit and a hate-producing industry. Let me say that again. Pornography remains a destructive pursuit in a hate-producing industry. Eddie Caparucci has a great book. I'll talk about it in the future episode. He has a great book called Going Deeper. And this is what he says. I'm going to quote from him. He says, "A significant hurdle I often experience with men is those who view pornography as something that is nothing wrong." Sorry, I butchered that. Let me try that again. "A significant hurdle I often experience with men who view pornography is they see nothing wrong with their actions. They think pornography is acceptable. Some even think it is healthy. No man can escape from sexual addiction until they first come to learn to hate their actions and understand they are not acceptable. There is nothing honorable about pornography, a practice that teaches men to objectify, dehumanize, and degrade women and other men. I ask men who think this is still Eddie here. I ask men who think pornography is harmless the following question. Tell me the last time you asked a 12-year-old girl what she wanted to be when she grows up. And her answer was, I want to take off my clothes and have sex in front of a camera with strange men and women. Those young girls don't exist unless they have undergone severe trauma that has crushed and eroded their self-worth. Pornography is also a health hazard because it serves as a stepping stone for the escalation of reckless and risky sexual behavior. Far too many men have found themselves moving to other destructive sexual practices as the stimulation generated by pornography starts to fade. My summary of that would be simply this: broken people watching broken people do broken things to other broken people. And I'm not here in judgment. I still struggle with the allure and pull of pornography. But I have learned, and let me just say this, I don't think heaping shame, how could you dare look at pornography with what I've just said? What is wrong with you? I don't think that's helpful as well. In fact, I've learned a much more effective, redemptive path for helping guys is the process of learning to be kind and curious and compassionate as to our story that has led us down this path. One of the guys that's been especially helpful to me in this has been Jay Stringer. His book, Unwanted, invites us to look even at our sexual fantasies or proclivities and ask ourselves, what are we trying to respond to or react from in the things we are destructively and compulsively attracted to? It's interesting how, it'd be interesting to know how Jay would respond to this whole the women fetish and fantasy thing where Asian women are seen as sexually available and submissive. And I'm sure he would say, it says far more about us than them when we are looking for a weaker person to display our power over. Where does that powerlessness come from, and why do we feel that we need to dominate over a weak, submissive woman? The last thing that I think anyone who's a pastor couldn't help but be struck with is, what would it like to be a pastor of the church that this young man was a part of? I found the name of the pastor. I want to pray for him at the end. I think his name is Jerry Dockery. And he pastors the Baptist church where this young man was a member. Apparently this young man, was called himself a Christian. He was a part of the church. He was part of the local evangelical culture. And now, of course, the church has since come out with a statement and expressed, rightfully so, their horror about the shootings and reaffirmed their view and the worth and value of women. They've done their best to distance themselves from this young man and his actions, and I can't imagine the stress and the crisis management that this church would be facing. As a pastor of people who come to my church, I have all sorts of people in our church who do all sorts of things. Sometimes I wonder, does our church attract people who say and do crazy things? I don't know. I've asked that. Maybe every pastor asks themselves of people who come to their church. And I'm not in any way saying that this pastor or this church is to blame or a part of what this young man did and is all, I totally understand the thing to say this doesn't represent us at any level. At the same time, as a pastor, it does make me wonder how many people knew this young man. Did this young man reach out for help in any way? I don't know the answer to these questions. What was the culture of this church? Was it a culture such that would encourage a young man with an addiction for, massage parlors or other things? Would it encourage him to come out to somebody else and share his desperation? Or would he need to feel hidden in his shame? What would have been different if there had just been one person who had come alongside this young man who was lost in addiction and said, there's hope. There's a way through this. And again, it makes me wonder how many young men in our churches who've grown up in the internet. And I wasn't exposed to pornography until I was 12, 13, but many young men have been exposed through far more graphic and things at much earlier impressionable ages than I was. How many young men in our church, and increasingly young women, are hopelessly trapped and are feeling increasingly desperate? What culture am I creating in our church that would encourage anybody with dark thoughts to look for help? I pray for these Asian women. I think of what's gone on in their lives. And, was this a hate crime? I mean, that's above my pay grade. Obviously, there was hate involved at every level. But I know the hate that's in my heart. And I just encourage you, if you're in a place of desperation, it's time to look for help. It's time to reach out for help. Otherwise, the darkness does take over every part of your life. Now, I'm not saying it's going to lead you to do what this young man did, but desperation causes people to do desperate things, crazy things. And people walk away from their marriages. People walk away from people they love. People are put in situations where they thought, you know what? I never thought my addiction would lead me here. Looking at things I never thought I would look at, doing things I never thought I would, and experiencing results that I never thought possible in my life. So I just want to, Lord, I pray for Jerry Dockery and the church where this young man was a part of. I ask for your wisdom for them, your grace for that entire church. And I just pray that you would allow this to be something where we would really pull the curtains off and the sheets away from all the desperate lives that people are living that are afraid to come out. And I just pray for this church. I pray for the families of these women. And I even pray for this young man, Lord, who is probably in a jail cell somewhere and just in a place of complete lostness. Your light can extend to every nook and cranny in this dark world. Till next time, we'll see you on Pastors on Porn. Continue to reach for the grace of God in your own life so you can extend that to other people. We'll see you next time.